Here's a Beyond the Pitch podcast quick hit from the WVSA Digital Network.
I think there's a couple of parts to this. One part, I think, is recognizing when to be very introspective and self-aware and when to be automatic and just perform. So when the athletes that I work with, by the time they get into a game, I don't want you to be introspective during the game. I want you to be in the moment. I want you to be automatic. I want you to be just moving and doing what it is that works for you. And I don't want you to be judging that while you're doing it. But the place for introspection is great during training, at the end of training, at night when you're going over the last week's worth of trainings and lifts and everything else that you kind of had. I think being able to kind of turn the volume up on introspection when it's appropriate to do it, and then turn it all the way down, I think is one of the best things that athletes can do to kind of get out of their heads. And there are lots of different ways to do that. For some athletes, it's almost like you set a time that you're allowed to be introspective and really dig into stuff and that kind of stuff. Maybe it's like 6 to 6:30 every night. I can take the time to really dig into it. But then outside of that, I'm going to turn that off. So you kind of get that practice every day, so that by the time game time comes, a year from now, when you're in your sophomore year, then you can just be automatic when you're kind of called upon to do that. Another thing that I think really helps is just taking perspective. Again, with athletes, we train them to look at the bad stuff, right? So like when my son finishes a training session and he gets back in the car on the way home, I say, what are the 3 things that you did really great today? What are 2 things that you struggled with? And what's 1 thing that you learned? So I get him in the habit of, we can acknowledge what it is that you need to work on, but we're going to frame it and orient it in a way that is growth promoting and exciting and those kinds of things. Other things that I've been telling athletes to do is like, okay, you had a particularly difficult lift or training session or whatever it was, and you've got this just dialogue playing in your head about all the things that you did wrong, and that just brings up all these other things that you did wrong 3 months ago and 3 years ago and everything else. When you get home, write all of that down. There's an advantage to writing things down on paper, and that is that you're getting bilateral stimulation, so you're having your brain kind of talk to itself. But the second piece that happens is after you have it all written down, leave it for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, and then come back to it and cross out everything that no longer matters. If you were to take a bird's eye view of your experience of this terrible training session, what are the pieces of that you need to remember that will help you get better, and what's the stuff that you can trash? Well, I want to remember that I need to make sure that I am keeping my head on a swivel. Okay, so cross out all of the other information about how you're never going to learn and you're never going to get it right and your teammates are going to hate you and your coach is going to yell at you. Like, we don't need any of that other stuff. We just need to remember my head on a swivel. So cross all the stuff out that doesn't matter. Being able to kind of zoom in to here's what it is that's happening when I'm really, really aware, and then zoom back out of, okay, now I don't need all that stuff. What do I take with me so that when it's time to be automatic, I can just be automatic. And then when I get to that game, I've got that cue phrase, head on a swivel. And so I'm remembering to look over my shoulder. I'm remembering to listen to my keeper. I'm remembering to cue into my coach, whatever it is, to kind of help me remember that stuff. I think those are some of my bigger tips for athletes who are having some difficulty with that balance. And the last thing that I would say too is remember that your thoughts are not always reflections of reality. So if you've had a whole bunch of kind of hyper awareness on, how your performance has been going lately, remember that some of that makes sense and does reflect reality, but some of that is totally overblown. So just being aware of your own cognitive biases of, we've all got a tendency towards this spotlight effect that's like, man, I made this one mistake. Everybody saw it. Everybody's judging me for it. In reality, that's probably not true. You might see it on film, but outside of that, most people probably missed that mistake that you made. It just feels like they did because we all have this tendency towards the spotlight effect. We've all got a confirmation bias. If I go into a game thinking that I'm going to make a mistake because I'm not very good and there's no reason why I should be playing in the first place and all of this kind of stuff, then I'm going to look for all the evidence that confirms that. When the reality is that there's probably a whole lot of evidence that I didn't pay any attention to because I was so in my head about all the ways that, things were going to go poorly for me. So I think being able to be aware of those and then go, oh, that was a thought that I had. That wasn't reality. Because you can sit here in my office and you can tell me over and over and over again that you can't walk. But at the end of our session, you're going to get up and walk out of my office, because thoughts aren't reality in most circumstances. They're just kind of these events that happen. So if we can keep that bigger perspective of what's the information that I want to keep versus what's the stuff that's just my brain chattering, because that's what it does, and this is the kind of chatter it learned to say, then we can kind of step back and be a little bit more automatic and stop stunting our performance.